My name is Annabelle Pegram. I'm an adjunct professor with the University of Canberra and chair of the university's Centenary of Canberra Participation Program, and I'm really delighted to be your Master of Ceremonies for this afternoon's Capitals Alliance Speakers Program. At the outset, I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting, and I pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present, and I extend this respect to all Indigenous people in attendance today. Now, in particular, I'd like to welcome Mr. David McKinnon, the Acting High Commissioner of Canada, and his colleagues Mary Lou Harman, Michelle Reardon and Karen May. Ms. Camila Gionchetti, the Second Secretary of the Embassy of Brazil, Mr. Paul Hoog, the Public Affairs Counsellor of the Embassy of the USA, and other diplomatic representatives with us today. Dr. Sarah Ryan, a member of the University of Canberra Council, Professor Lyndon Anderson, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Design, Mr. Tony Trobe, the President of the Institute of Architects ACT Chapter, Mr. Alistair Swain, the ACT Government Architect, and Air Marshal David Evans, the former Chairman of the National Capital Authority when the Alliance was formed in 2001. And welcome also to all of the staff, the students, the alumni and members of the Canberra community with us today. In 2001, I attended the Canadian Institute of Planners Conference in Ottawa to speak in a session with representatives of Washington, Brasilia and Ottawa about national capital planning, promotion and design. And the synergies between the cities were very obvious and very powerful. And out of that conference, the Capitals Alliance was established as a global forum of exchange by international colleagues of ideas and solutions on the very unique challenges facing national capital cities. Since that time, each of the capitals have hosted conferences, and the Alliance has continued to provide opportunities to share ideas and to promote the story of the past, the present and the future of our national capitals. And we also hope that in the future we can strengthen mutual research related to our cities. For this centenary year, the university was very keen to ensure that we refocused attention on this special relationship, and we were delighted by the enthusiasm and the support of the High Commission of Canada and the embassies of Brazil and the Embassy of the United States of America in making this happen by sponsoring speakers to come here today to address us. As you'll see from the program that you now have, our four speakers will address you, and then at the close, there'll be time for questions and answers with a panel moderated by Alex Sloan. So feel free to jot down your questions as we move along. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Adjunct Professor Peter Tonkin. Peter graduated in architecture from the University of Sydney in 1977, and I'm really pleased to say that he was one of my peers and a great mate during that time and onwards from there. Peter's completed a very wide range of highly significant projects. He formed Tonkin Zuleika Greer Architects in 1987, and that firm has a leading reputation for design excellence throughout the country, with 100 industry national and international design awards and competitions won by the practice. He has many major projects, which include, among them, the Australian War Memorial in London, the public domain at the Sydney Olympic Park, the Hyde Park Barracks Museum, and most recently in Canberra, the National Arboretum, winning both the competition and designing the marvellous new building that we see, and which was awarded the Romualdo Jurgler Award for Public Architecture about a week ago by the ACT chapter, and we're very confident that it will take out and should take out a national award. He's a trustee of the Historic Houses of New South Wales and has served on a very wide range of public committees, and I'm delighted that he's here today to address us in his talk called Canberra, Australia's Front Yard. Peter Tonkin.
I'm sorry about the grey skies, but as I flew in this morning, I've got lovely blue sky over the top of the fog. This is, as Annabelle said, a very personal reflection on my own very long-standing love-hate relationship with Canberra, Australia's own city beautiful. And I think after 100 years, Canberra seems to encapsulate many of the national qualities of Australia, from excessive rule-making and obedience to sweeping plains, from a visionary and innovative imagination to the compromise of that imagination by petty political squabbling, from an engagement with nature to an avoidance, I think, of serious reflection about our own role and our own future. I'm dividing this talk into 4 sections. The first one I called Not a Place for Agoraphobics, and that really, to a certain extent, looks at the structure of the city and how it sits upon the ground. The next one I've called Front Yard, Backyard, looking, I think, very briefly at the conflict between Canberra as a national capital and Canberra as a place to live. The next section will be called, and I quote this from Tone Wheeler, who gives an extremely amusing talk upon Canberra, much more cynical, I think, than mine will be, called Satellites and Planets. And that really talks about something to do with the planning of the city and how it's affected its urbanity. And my last section will be Urbanity at Last, as a kind of, I think, wrap-up or conclusion to the talk. And so not a place for agoraphobics. Agoraphobia, of course, is the fear of wide open spaces. Australians are suspicious of Canberra and very often lump the city together with the federal government. So they talk of Canberra and it doesn't really mean the city, it means Kevin Rudd or whoever happens to be sitting in the chair on the hill. And we're jealous of Canberra, we people who are not from the city. We're teased, I think, by its incompleteness. We're certainly confused by its roads, and we're rather off-put by its acres of grass. But I think overreaching all of that, Canberra... Sorry. Sound effects. It remains one of our fastest growing communities, and therefore it cannot be a failure. And as a new city and a new nation, I think it represents a very complex ongoing experiment that deserves really our reflection. And I think building on Griffin's engagement with the landscape, which was at the time highly innovative, and he engaged with the landscape on a very subtle level because he realised that Canberra would remain incomplete for a long time, and if he structured the city so that its hills became its monuments, that level of incompletion would be less obvious and we would get a monumental scale to the city from day one. But the reverse of that very visionary plan, of course, is the agoraphobia. And the first of the issues to do with agoraphobia I'd like to touch on is what I see as a little bit of fear in the design of Canberra, a tentativeness and a lack of commitment in the way we've treated the capital. And that relates to its incompleteness, from the half-formed and half-filled nature of the centre, the 2 wide roads, the endless sweeps of useless lawn, the great gaps between the monuments, and the fact that the monuments themselves, no matter how big they are, always seem that little bit too small under that huge sky and between the great ranges of mountains. And the clear light that, most of the time you get in Canberra is both fortunate and unfortunate. It shows up the sculpting of buildings very beautifully, but it also, I think, emphasises every streak in the concrete and every poor detail. Canberra's centre seems to have been planned for a future that we never quite reach, a future time when there will be 4 times the number of people living in the city, 5 or 6 times the number of federal buildings, a town hall, a public transport system, a big civic market. And the real irony is that all of those things are things that Canberra designed into his core. We've been afraid to fill up the centre so that we push the things out to the periphery for fear of messing up that ceremonial front yard, the important heart of the city. We've been too lacking in confidence to commit to actually building Canberra, so instead we push things out to Woden or Belconnen or, worse still, the airport. We build second-rate boxes far away where the planners, whoever they might be, can pretend that they don't matter. The second source of this agoraphobia, and I think the chief one, is the road system. As a friend of mine said only a week ago, you shouldn't have to take a freeway to go from one suburb to another. It's just wrong. And that really comes from the fact that there have been, at times in Canberra, way too much funding and not enough population compared with all of the other cities in Australia. And it's interesting, I think, comment on freeways as an urban response, that Canberra still suffers from traffic jams. The freeway bias to planning leads me to another issue, which is less obvious to residents because they learn to find their way around, but it's foremost in the minds of everybody who isn't from Canberra who comes here on a holiday. Partly due to Griffin's geometry, the lack of an orientation from a grid, and mostly due to the freeways, you always get lost whenever you come to Canberra. And I developed a phrase for this chiefly due to the new Garelock interchange down the road, which has earned the nickname the Gridlock interchange. I've been Canberra'd, where you take the wrong exit and you suddenly find yourself heading off into the wrong suburb. And it struck me many years ago that in most cities, the roads actually go somewhere. In Canberra, they don't. They go past somewhere. And you have to turn off the road to get from the road to the somewhere. To find anything, to find petrol, to find shops, to find the centre. And that reminds me very much of Alice in Through the Looking Glass, who's busily trying to get away from the house to get into the garden. And every time she walks down a road that seems to lead to the garden, she winds up back at the house. And as she describes it, the paths twist and shake themselves. And I think that's something to do with the layout of Canberra in many visitors' minds. You can never get where you want to go. You always wind up somewhere else. Which brings me to this notion of front yard, backyard. Canberra seems to embody to me an inherent conflict between, on the one hand, there's its role as Australia's front yard, its government centre, its nationally symbolic seat of government. Like everybody's suburban front yard, it's tidy, it's public, not private, it's image-driven, and a whole lot of it is completely unused. On the other hand is its function as home. It's home to 350,000 Australians. It's home also to an extremely flourishing quaternary sector economy, so a sector of knowledge and government and research, not a sector of manufacturing or agriculture. And to a certain extent, this conflict was resolved a decade or so ago when the ACT was made a self-governing territory rather than a tool of the Commonwealth government. And at that point, most of the city, not all, became self-determining. And at the same time, its generous federal subsidies by and large evaporated. And the big rich states like Victoria and New South Wales still support the ACT. But at least there's some sense that Canberra's paying its way and not completely living off somebody else. And the people of Canberra don't actually get that much better deal than the rest of us. Certainly, I think no better deal than little states like Tasmania. Once upon a time, the people of Canberra were nearly all public servants, or people who sold tomatoes or dry cleaning to public servants. But now they're just as nearly, not quite, but nearly, just as likely to have the same jobs for the same employers as the rest of Australia. So that sense of it being a front yard is now linked to its sense of being a backyard. And Canberra's embracing other roles than simply a government showpiece. Many of them take advantage of the wide open spaces for car races and flower shows, for sculpture festivals and hot air ballooning. In other senses, the backyards of Canberra have come to support industries as diverse as illegal fireworks and legal pornography. Which brings me to my third point, which is satellites and planets. And I'll tell you a little brief yarn that when Tone Wheeler gave this talk, and I don't think Tone had a very good experience in Canberra, his opening line was that Canberra's the only city in the world where the first suburb you come to is called Downer. and his phrase is satellites and planets, which I've stolen. And I'll start off by talking about Griffin's design, because it really is the kind of holy grail of Canberra. And it's interesting that in that plan of what is now central Canberra, which is the Griffin plan, he accommodated what is roughly the current population of Canberra in an area something like 1/5 the size of the current city, so that his city was 5 times denser than the Canberra we see today. The city that he and Marion designed did have suburbia. They liked suburbia, the Griffins. They come from designing a beautiful suburban development at Rock Glen in Iowa, and were going to go on to designing suburbs in Victoria and, of course, Castle Crag in Sydney. But the Canberra competition drawings from 1912 also illustrate big areas in the city of what we would call perimeter apartment blocks. You can't tell how tall they are. They look to me about 3 to 4 floors. But they certainly posit this sense of those grand civic boulevards, Kings Avenue and Commonwealth Avenue, being really civic and urbane rather than their tendency at the moment to be featureless parkways through the bush. And of course, this all comes back to the period when Canberra had its great spurt of development in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, it was immoral and certainly unhealthy for Australians to live in apartments. We just didn't do it. Certainly not if you were a child. The backyard was king. And the 1950s was the time when, after years of the federal government drip-feeding the city with development funds and with token numbers of public servants to try and populate it around the little Parliament House, Menzies finally bit the bullet and committed a substantial amount of funding and then a substantial employment basis to Canberra so that the city could grow. And of course, at the time, they found a kind of wasteland of dotted houses across a plain, what a politician in the early 20s called a good sheep station spoilt. And at the time, of course, we needed an expert to plan the city. And they hadn't had much luck with the Yanks who tried to plan it in the pre-war period. And Menzies, of course, was British to the bootstraps, as he said, in love with the young Queen Victoria, so he hired an English expert called Lord Holford to come out and do Canberra. And if you look at his work in the UK, he was the king of the separated, sanitised suburb, and that's what he laid out over the city of Canberra. Most damagingly, I think, he laid out the vast freeway network across the inner city so that instead of any possibility of urbanity with these parkways, instead of a degree of density and activity at the nodes that Griffin drew, we got huge, meaningless, confusing cloverleaf interchanges, which continue, I think, to this day to be a barrier between a possibility of an urban centre to Canberra, because of course no politician is going to spend millions of dollars ripping up a perfectly good road. And the other crime that came at this time was either due to Holford or the National Capital Development Commission, the NCDC, and that was decentralising the city by building satellites. And these satellite cities, Woden, Belconnen and Tuggeranong, make up roughly 2/3 of Canberra's population and leave the middle, which should be the densest part of it, oddly called civic, dead. And the other misfortune of Canberra under this kind of heading is because the plans are so grandiose, they're never actually completed. So these plans turn into planettes. And roads, even though we're getting more sensible with our funding, roads still lead nowhere, and monumental buildings face the wrong way or are stranded amidst acres of grass as sites next to them and around them are left vacant for a possible future something or other. These plans that turned into planettes are often way too grandiose and requiring far too much development commitment at any one time. But they also often simply go out of fashion, so that the 1960s notion of a grand national place in the middle of the parliamentary triangle, huge and windswept though it would have been, turned into a 1980s postmodern Washington Mall in the same spot. Now we're left with little bits of all of them, and desperately trying to make sense of the, again, vacant lots crisscrossed by goat tracks. Since self-government, however, the market, which is, an amorphous driver, but nevertheless a driver of wealth and speculation, has taken over some of the planning, and what became known as the No Can Do Club is no more. And we can see the results across the city, not only in the flourishing number of apartments that are starting to re-densify some of the boulevards, but also in a few areas where there is at least a little sense of a more complete planning because one developer does the whole lot. And because this planning is forced to engage with the existing city rather than presuppose a city that doesn't exist. So, urbanity at last. I think there are signs that Canberra's turning into, or perhaps even has turned into, a real city. We've had a couple of generations who've been born here and who've died here. And as we just did a master plan for ACT's cemeteries, I've learnt that the cemeteries are on the verge of filling up. A sure sign of maturity. Canberra has its own football teams, its own television stations, and an extreme, I think, sense of belonging and loyalty on the part of its residents. And there are, on a purely physical level and a part of a cultural level, hints that a future Canberra where good planning might join with density and with the Griffin's wonderful urban structuring of nature, where you might not have to drive out to Fyshwick to get a bit of grit, and where you might not be able to park right next to where you want to shop, and where there will be thriving places where people populate the urban realm. And it's not liked by the Griffinites, but I think one of the signs of this new Canberra is a development called New Acton. And most of you all know New Acton. It's a group of high-rise apartment buildings with some workplaces, a heritage refurbishment, a hotel, a couple of good cafes, a cinema, possibly a little theatre, although I don't know whether that's opened yet. But what makes it work is that it's complete. They've taken a city block and they've built it. It doesn't rely on anything else next door. They've engaged with the existing city so that stands of mature trees and one very handsome heritage building become the foci and the structure of the place, so that it builds up that 1980s buzzword, builds up a palimpsest, a sense of layering, which Canberra's never had. It's also where you get a bit of choice in one easy to navigatable area, so that if you don't like the coffee in that cafe, you can go to the next one, and the one supports the other. And I think there's just nowhere else like it in Australia. It could only be in Canberra, particularly since when my wife and I went there about 6 months ago, we found an echidna crossing Edinburgh Avenue into New Acton. And, what other capital city in the world would you find such a thing right in the middle of town? There's for a long time been talk of a fast train linking Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney. And I'd like to spend a little while thinking about what the implications of that might be. It's been interesting to me the way that the upgrading of the Hume and Federal highways has greatly shrunk the distance between Sydney and Canberra, so that what used to be a fairly arduous journey is now a fairly straightforward day trip. And there's even been talk, which I think the fog this morning might prove to be absolutely ridiculous, is that the Canberra airport might become the second Sydney airport, relying on the fast train. And quite ironically, if that were all to happen, if Canberra was to become a sort of leafy southern suburb of Sydney, it would dramatically undermine the Founding Fathers' 1900 ruling that the capital had to be at least 150 miles from Sydney so that Sydney wouldn't come to dominate the government or the environment of the national capital and undermine, therefore, Melbourne's influence. I can't see that happening because I think the federal government's presence is sufficiently strong and the ethos of Australia is sufficiently strong that Canberra will always feel separate to Sydney, even if the magic bullet of the bullet train does happen. After 100 years, I think we can be proud of our experiment in Canberra. We have, after all, a real city, identifiable, landmarking itself with its own character, its own residents, its own feel. And this has been an experiment, I think, as we've seen the government settle here and become at home here, an experiment of nation building as much as city building. The Canberra experiment, to me, in retrospect, seems every bit as adventurous as the British experiment in sending out 11 little ships full of convicts to a completely unknown shore when they founded the colony of New South Wales. But the result is a city that remains one of our fastest growing, one of our wealthiest, one of our best educated. It's also our only big inland city. And I think, to me especially, this is very significant because Australians have hugged the coastline throughout their history. And I think we can all share the sentiments of the people who selected the site here in appreciating the virtue of the mountain setting and what they call the healthy mountain air. In my mind, the saviour of Canberra will be its border with New South Wales. If New South Wales is never convinced to cede to the ACT more land, it will be forced to densify. And the magic of that structure laid out by Griffin, with its density, its boulevards, its public buildings, its built-up centre, will create a city full of vibrancy and urbanity. I'd have to say the cynic in me reckons they will grab a bit more land from New South Wales and continue with the satellites. Thank you.